Hi guys, welcome to this final lesson on rivers. Now we have looked at different landforms in the upper course, middle course and lower course, and then we focus a lot on the causes of flooding and link that to hydrographs. So now naturally we're going to look at how can we actually manage and reduce flood risk, and we're going to look at an example at the end of this session as well. So when we talk about either coastal management or river management, we can split this into hard and soft engineering. Now, hard engineering is stuff that's artificial, which means it's man-made. It tends to be a lot more expensive, but it's very effective. Whereas soft engineering is more sustainable. That's the key word I would use. It's more in line with nature. So take a look at these pictures. These are all different types of hard and soft engineering that we can use to manage flood risk. Now, the top three are hard engineering and the bottom three are soft engineering. So at this stage, I'd ask you to pause the video and see if you can just recognize by picture what these hard and soft engineering techniques are of managing flood risk and rivers. Have a go. Okay, so here's what you should have said. So you've got dams and reservoirs here. Now this is actually a flood relief channel, but some of you might have said it's channel straightening, and it would look very similar if it was a picture, so I'll let you have either. This is the idea of an embankment, and to create that embankment, they might have dredged the river, which means removing the sediment from the riverbed and placing it on the riverbanks. This is afforestation, so they're planting trees here. This is called floodplain zoning, and this is river restoration. So we're going to go through each of these now, a little overview of what they are, whether they're hard or soft, and you absolutely need to know the pros and cons of these. Okay, there's always going to be a question about evaluating or discussing hard and soft engineering techniques. Same again with coast. So let's start the hard engineering techniques with dams and reservoirs. So in theory, it's just a large barrier that you put across the river, and therefore you can control how much water flows through the river at a given time. So if there's been lots of rainfall and further downstream it's looking like it's reaching bank full capacity and might burst its banks, they can shut these gates off or significantly reduce the flow coming into the river. So that's obviously going to reduce flood risk. Advantages, obviously we can use this for hydroelectric power as well, and the water can be used for agriculture, for recreational activities, for drinking, and it just means that we can massively reduce flood risk because we can regulate river flow. However, as we said before with hard engineering techniques, they're not natural at all, so they're not in line with the environment. They can be quite damaging, actually. They're extremely expensive to build and maintain. People might have to leave for the area that floods behind the reservoir, and of course that could damage ecosystems as well. It can affect fish migrating upstream, as just one example. Another hard engineering technique is this idea of channelization or channel straightening. Now, that means that we can kind of divert the flow of the water. So if there's an urban area nearby, we can straighten the channel, which means it can go through a lot quicker. So it's really effective at protecting kind of high-risk zones. However, if you are speeding up river flow in one place, that's great for that place, but further downstream, you're actually increasing flood risk because obviously their river is being filled quicker. Again, it's hard engineering, so it's very expensive. It might cause people to need to move whilst they're straightening the channel. And again, if you're doing anything to a natural ecosystem, that can have massive environmental implications on the food chains and ecosystems that are there. And the last one for hard engineering are embankments. Sometimes these are known as levees, and they're just raised walls that are built along riverbanks. And that means that this river can hold more water. Okay, it's increasing the carrying capacity of the river. So again, this is going to stop the river flooding, okay, because it can hold more water, stop it going onto the floodplains. Bit cheaper than dams, so that's how we can evaluate this one. But they can fail. And actually, if the river does overflow the levee, it can actually increase flood risk because now that river water, imagine this one's flooded and it's sat here, is nowhere for it to go. It can't just go back uphill into the river. It's just going to sit there. Whereas if the levee wasn't there, it could just kind of run back into the river. So it can actually increase flood risk as well. It's kind of what happened in New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit. They had artificial levees. And once those levees failed, it actually caused more flooding because that river water couldn't go anywhere. And they're going to need sort of constant maintenance. You're going to have issues to do with animals burrowing in here, plants growing, that sort of idea, which, biological weathering, which can have an impact. And it can restrict access to the river as well, so for recreational activities. On to the soft ones then. Generally, these are going to be cheaper and more sustainable, but maybe not as effective. The first one is this idea of afforestation. You remember we talked about lag time and hydrographs last session. Basically, in theory, if you plant more trees, they can intercept and block more water. That's therefore not as much rainwater going into the river. So good things, it's reducing the flow of water going into the river, so it won't burst its banks as quickly. If you're planting trees, you're increasing biodiversity. You're going to have more ecosystems that are going to benefit from that. You're going to release more oxygen. You're going to take in more carbon dioxide. So it's improving air quality. And it's pretty cheap to plant trees. But of course, trees take time to grow, so that's a negative. And if where are you going to do this? You're going to have to go through farmland. That might cost money. You might not be allowed access to that area. So it is dependent on where exactly you're allowed to plant the trees. It's quite a small scale fix. You'd have to plant a lot of trees for this to have a real impact. On to floodplain zoning. This is literally just where you are choosing what to do on the floodplain. Okay, so a floodplain is the flat area, we've looked at this before, the flat area either side of a river that can flood and does flood. And you're just basically saying what that area can be used for. So if you look at this example, we're saying the area closest to the river is unsuitable for building, but it's okay for farming because you can just get those animals in if there's likely to be a flood. You might have some sport fields nearby, which again are unoccupied a lot of the time. But you're going to make sure that your really important infrastructure is further away from the river itself. So of course, that's going to save money because you're not going to damage vital infrastructure. And it just encourages this idea of sustainable land use. But of course, this isn't perfect for everyone. It's going to limit how much you can build and where. If you're in a poor country, you're not going to have the luxury of making these choices, which is why we have such high risks of deaths from floods in poorer countries. And actually, where do you start with this? There might already be some buildings in that high risk zone which you would need to potentially demolish for this to work. So there's a couple of negatives for you there. And the last one is this idea of river restoration, which is literally what it says. You're just restoring the river back to its natural state. Maybe you've straightened the river channel or built a flood relief channel or built a dam. It's basically reversing anything you have already done to it. And if you're doing that, it's going to improve biodiversity. The wildlife's going to come back really quickly. It's going to reduce flood risk downstream because the river's going to slow down. And once it's done, you just let nature take its course, so there's minimal maintenance. It might be costly initially, especially if you're removing concrete and things like that. That's going to take time. And again, is this going to work in a really heavily urbanized area? Probably not. It's going to be far too expensive. Okay, so only suitable for sort of small scale areas. So here's an example, just one little 4 marker from an AQA exam. Explain how, so again, apologies, look at the actual picture first of all. Study figure 1, a diagram showing floodplain zoning. So they're giving you this figure. Explain how soft engineering strategies can help reduce the impact of river flooding. Use figure 1 and your own understanding. Now, you could get full marks just by talking about floodplain zoning, but that's quite hard to get 4 marks on that. There's not that much you can talk about. And you don't need to evaluate because the command word is just to explain. So really, you're just saying how it works. I personally would probably do 2 different soft engineering strategies here. So I'd get 2 marks, 2 linked sentences for talking about floodplain zoning. And then I'm going to talk about river restoration or afforestation. Okay, on to the example. So I'm going to use the Somerset Levels flood. Of course, you'll have your own case studies. You can feel free to use this one if you want to, or use whatever example you've been given at your school. But Somerset is a really good one because there was quite catastrophic flooding for the UK. But have a look at the picture, look at the map. What if you haven't studied this one, why do you think this area is so prone to flooding? There's a couple of correct answers here, so have a little think. Okay, and if you look really carefully, it's called the Somerset Levels for a reason, because it's extremely flat. So we're going back to that cause of relief here and talking about flat land and reduced surface runoff. And it's also very close to the Bristol Channel, which feeds into the Atlantic Ocean. So they get lots and lots of storms here barreling off of the southwest. And this information here just kind of summarizes that, talking about the fact it's really flat. They had severe flooding in 2014, lots of storms. I think there was 13 storms that year. Poorly maintained rivers as well, so a bit of bad decision making, and lots of agriculture in the nearby area. So think back to that human cause of flooding of agriculture. 600 homes were flooded. Nobody died, fortunately. Whole villages were cut off. Agricultural land was submerged for weeks. And of course, that would have economic and social impacts as well. So with that in mind, they had to do something to try and stop this being a problem again in the future. And these are just some of the things that they have done. So again, we're going to, instead of categorizing into hard and soft, you can also categorize into immediate and long-term. So just be aware of that. You might get a question about immediate and long-term responses. So they dredged the rivers, the Parrett and the Tone, which meant it can hold more water, because one of the biggest causes was the agriculture and all that topsoil running into the rivers and making them shallower. So they just dredged that out and took some of that material and dumped it on the sides, which is great because it stopped that flood risk because it now can hold more water. And they installed temporary pumps to try and take out the water from those fields and pump it into places that aren't being used for as much infrastructure and agriculture and things like that. And that sort of helped people kind of in the short term immediately. In the long term, they use some of that dredge material to create embankments and reinforce those. They're always maintaining those rivers because there's always sediment building up from the agriculture, so they're always dredging them out now. They have restored wetlands so they can absorb lots of water naturally and kind of slow down that lag time or increase the lag time. And it's much cheaper, obviously, because it's soft engineering. And hard engineering wise as well, they have improved the pumps because those pumps were pretty inadequate at first, but they've made them be able to basically pump more water and be a lot more effective for long-term flood management. And there's just one example. This is from an Edexcel paper this time. Using a named example, explain how a combination of hard and soft engineering techniques has been used to manage river flooding. Evaluate the effectiveness of these techniques in the short and long term. Wow. Pause the video, give it a go, or at least plan your answer. Think how many paragraphs, how would you categorize those paragraphs? So one on this, one on that, and then think about what structure your actual paragraphs would be, and then press play when you're ready. Okay, if you've done it right, you must name your example. So Somerset Levels flood or whatever flood you guys have used. And then you've got kind of two choices here. You can either do a paragraph on hard engineering, a paragraph on soft, and within those talk about immediate and long-term benefits. Or you could do a paragraph on immediate and a paragraph on long-term, and within those talk about the hard and soft engineering techniques. But in theory, there's 5 things you need to do. Name the example, and in the next 2 paragraphs, you've got to get hard, soft, immediate, and long-term. How you do that is not the end of the world, but think of it as like a tick box. You've got to do all those things. And I would use P structure, so point, evidence, explain, evaluate. Short-term versus long-term, scale, local, national, global, all these sorts of themes that we've talked about before. And then I would do a conclusion kind of summarizing those 2 main paragraphs and saying, overall, what do you think the best example of river management was for this particular example? And of course, that would be your choice. You're not going to get marked up or down either way. I hope that's been useful. Enjoy the rest of the lessons, and that is Rivers done.